Michael Jackson could stop a stadium with one move, a single spin, one perfectly timed pause, and 80,000 people would lose their minds. But here's something almost nobody asks. Before he ever stepped on a stage, before the world knew his name, who taught him how to stand like that? Who taught him how to freeze an audience with silence? How to turn a simple walk into a moment people would talk about for decades? Because none of it came from nowhere. Michael didn't invent the king of pop out of thin air. He built him piece by piece out of men most young fans today have barely heard of. And one of them wasn't even a musician. Let's get into it. And if you love the real story behind the legend, hit subscribe before we do. To understand this, you have to go back before the Moonwalk existed, before anyone called him a genius. Back to a small house in Gary, Indiana, where a boy barely tall enough to reach the television dial would sit inches from the screen, completely still, refusing to blink. His brothers would call him to come play. He wouldn't move. And his father would tell him it was time for rehearsal. He wouldn't move, because on that screen was a man doing something Michael had never seen a human body do before, and he was terrified that if he looked away for even a second, he would miss the secret. That man was Fred Astaire. If you're picturing a wild, explosive performer, stop. Fred Astaire was the opposite. He was elegance, precision. Every step measured to the fraction of a second, every movement so clean it looked effortless, even though it wasn't. Michael later admitted that he studied Astaire's films over and over, frame by frame, trying to understand how a man could make something so difficult look like it required no effort at all. Years later, when Michael Jackson finally met Fred Astaire in person, or worse, he described it as one of the most nerve-wracking moments of his life. He wasn't meeting a fellow entertainer. In his mind, he was meeting a teacher, the man who had shown him long before he could even read properly that dance could be a kind of storytelling, not just movement. Astaire reportedly told him that he had watched Michael's videos and admired his control. For a boy who had spent countless nights rewinding a television tape just to see one turn again, that single compliment meant more than any award ever could. But Astaire only gave Michael the elegance. Someone else gave him the mystery. That man was Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin died before Michael Jackson ever became a global star, so the two never spoke, but that didn't matter. Michael studied Chaplin's silent films obsessively, especially the way Chaplin used simple, exaggerated movement to make an entire theater feel something without saying a single word. No dialogue, no explanation. Just a look, a walk, a gesture, and suddenly the audience understood exactly what the character felt. Michael took that lesson and turned it into a signature. Watch any of his most famous performances closely, and you'll notice something strange. He barely talks. He lets the tilt of a hat, the flick of a wrist, or one long pause do all the emotional work instead. That's not an accident. That's Chaplin's fingerprint, buried inside a pop star's choreography. The silence, the theatrical stillness, the way emotion is implied rather than shouted. That is Chaplin, translated into a music video. So now Michael had elegance from Astaire and mystery from Chaplin. But he still needed danger. He still needed the kind of performer who could make a room feel like it was 1 second away from chaos. That's where Jackie Wilson comes in. If Fred Astaire was control and Charlie Chaplin was silence, Jackie Wilson was pure, unfiltered electricity. Nicknamed Mr. Excitement, Wilson would drop into splits mid-song, spin across the stage, and hit notes with a physicality that looked almost impossible to sustain. Audiences didn't just watch Jackie Wilson, they panicked. Fans would scream, faint, and rush the stage, decades before anyone used the phrase stadium chaos to describe a concert. Michael studied Wilson's performances the same obsessive way he studied everyone else. Some of his sharpest, most sudden movements, the ones that look almost violent in their precision, trace directly back to Wilson's stage presence. Michael would later say that watching old footage of Wilson taught him that a performer's job wasn't just to be seen. It was to make people feel like something unpredictable might happen at any second. Put those three influences together, and something interesting happens. Astaire gave Michael the discipline to make impossible moves look smooth. Chaplin gave him the instinct to let silence carry emotion instead of words. Wilson gave him the raw unpredictability that made a live show feel dangerous in the best possible way. None of these three men were pop stars. In the way we think of pop stars today, one was a ballroom dancer from old Hollywood, one was a silent film comedian from a different era entirely, one was an R&B showman most casual fans have never heard of, and yet all three ended up living inside a single moonwalk. Here's the part that most people miss completely. Michael Jackson never treated any of this as a secret. He talked about these influences constantly, in interviews and documentaries, in his own writing. He wanted people to know where the magic came from. He understood something that a lot of performers try to hide, that greatness is rarely invented from nothing. It's usually inherited, studied, absorbed, and then pushed further than anyone thought possible. Think about that for a moment. A 5 or 6-year-old boy, sitting alone in front of a television, refusing to blink, terrified of missing one single movement from a man who had already been famous for decades before he was even born. That boy grew up to headline the biggest stages on the planet, and he still carried every one of those lessons with him every single night he performed. That's really the whole story here. The king of pop didn't build his throne alone. He studied 3 very different masters, took a piece of genius from each one and fused it into something the world had never seen before. Elegance from a ballroom legend, silence from a silent film icon, danger from an R&B showman history almost forgot. 3 completely different worlds, one impossible performer. And there's something quietly moving about that, if you really sit with it. Before Michael Jackson was a legend, before he was untouchable, before stadiums chanted his name, he was just a kid on a living room floor, memorizing a stranger's every move because some part of him already knew exactly who he wanted to become. But here's something even stranger. Michael didn't just borrow moves from these men, he borrowed their discipline, and that discipline is the part almost nobody talks about. Fred Astaire was famous in Hollywood for something that had nothing to do with talent. It was an obsession. He would rehearse a single 4-second sequence for days, sometimes weeks, until it looked like nothing at all, like he had simply wandered into that movement by accident. Michael adopted that exact same obsession. People who worked with him during his Motown years and later during his solo career described rehearsals that stretched for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours straight, with Michael repeating one turn or one drop to the floor over and over, refusing to stop until it looked effortless. That wasn't natural talent showing up on command. That was Fred Astaire's ghost standing behind him, whispering that effortlessness only exists after you've suffered for it in private. Chaplin's discipline worked differently, but it shaped Michael just as deeply. Chaplin was known for planning every single frame of a scene before filming even began, storyboarding emotion the way most directors storyboard action. Michael brought that same instinct into the music video era, an era he essentially helped invent. Before Michael Jackson, a music video was mostly a band playing their instruments on camera. After Thriller, a music video was a short film, with a beginning, a middle, an end, and emotional beats planned out shot by shot. That structure, that insistence on treating a 3-minute song like a complete story, traces back to a silent comedian Michael had never even met. And Jackie Wilson's influence went beyond the physical, too. Wilson was known for something dangerous in his era, performing with total abandon, giving so much of himself on stage that band members and audiences alike sometimes worried he might genuinely hurt himself mid-performance. That same intensity shows up in Michael's live shows decades later, the way he would push his body past reasonable limits, night after night, tour after tour, because stopping short felt to him like failing the audience. It's part of why his performances felt like events instead of concerts. It's also, painfully, part of a pattern that likely contributed to the physical toll performing took on his body over the years. So, when you put all of this together, a different picture emerges. This isn't just a story about a talented kid who watched some old videos and picked up a few dance moves. This is a story about a child who reverse-engineered greatness. He looked at 3 men from 3 completely different worlds, noticed exactly what made each of them unforgettable, and then spent the rest of his life trying to combine all 3 into a single human being standing under a spotlight. Think about how unusual that actually is. Most performers find one style and stick to it. Michael Jackson looked at ballroom elegance, silent film storytelling, and raw R&B danger, and decided none of them alone was enough. He wanted all of it, at the same time, in one body, on one stage. That ambition alone tells you something about why there has never really been another Michael Jackson, before or since. It wasn't just about natural gift. It was about a very specific, almost impossible blueprint, drawn from influences most fans never even think to look for. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this whole story. The people we call once-in-a-generation talents rarely built themselves in isolation. They studied. They rewound the tape. They sat a little too close to the television, refusing to blink, terrified of missing the one detail that might unlock everything. Michael Jackson happened to do that with 3 of the most different performers of the 20th century, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. There's one more detail worth sitting with before we go. Michael Jackson spent his entire career being called the most original performer of his generation, a man who supposedly came out of nowhere with a style nobody had ever seen. But the truth, once you actually look at it closely, is almost the opposite. He was original precisely because he refused to copy just one person. Anyone can imitate a single idol and end up as a decent tribute act. Michael took 3 separate legacies that had nothing to do with each other, from 3 completely different decades and 3 completely different worlds of performance, and forced them to live inside one body. That fusion, not raw talent alone, is what made him impossible to replicate. Plenty of dancers since have tried to move like him. Almost none of them realized they were really trying to move like Astaire, Chaplin, and Wilson all at once. So tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of Jackie Wilson before today? And out of Fred Astaire's elegance, Chaplin's silence, or Wilson's danger, which one do you think shaped Michael Jackson the most? If you want more real stories behind the legend, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more coming.